Hello everyone and welcome to Eagle Eye View. I'm Jacob Noterman. Former President Jimmy Carter passed away. Carter served as the 39th President of the United States from 1977 to 1981, and he was also the 76th Governor of Georgia, serving from 1971 to 75. Famous for his international peace initiatives and humanitarian efforts during and after his presidency, he is the only U.S. president to call Georgia home. To walk us through a brief biography of his life, we have Dr. Chris Caplinger. He is an assistant professor within the Department of History at Georgia Southern University. He's a little bit of our John Meacham when we're talking about President Carter. Dr. Caplinger, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Jacob. Happy to be here.
Now, today we're talking about, obviously, the late President Carter. Can you tell us quickly just how you first got introduced to studying the former president?
I was an undergraduate at Emory, and he held, after he left the White House, he held a position on faculty there. He wasn't there frequently, but
he wasn't giving many lectures.
No, well, he did give individual lectures, but he also did something that really touched almost every incoming student, every student at Emory, that he was a part of the new student convocation. So for a number of years, before I was there and then well after I was there, he would be one of the speakers at New Student Convocation. And I managed to wrangle an invitation all 4 years I was there. So I did it as a freshman, and then I worked on the orientation staff, and so was there with new cadres of students when I was an upperclassman. So in my senior year, actually, he did question and answers afterwards, and so as a 22-year-old, I stood up in the auditorium when my question was answered. And so that was a lot of fun.
With this personal connection that you have with the former president and going into studying him later on in your career, what kinds of moments or personality traits stand out to you?
He clearly was oriented toward improving people's lives. He was always very upfront from his campaign throughout his life, talking about issues of his faith, which were an anchor for what it was he was doing. He believed in doing the right thing to the point. He's a politician, of course. Several people, his biographers will explain that one way to really get under President Carter's skin was to say that this was going to look good politically. He didn't. Well, it was almost like he was questioning the your motive for doing something.
Okay.
So he really, and he was frustrated that it was that. He was frustrated that it was that way. He was frustrated when people would sometimes, sort of frame that thing that way. He was frustrated when he was dealing with people who were aware of the political implications of the things that he was asking them to do. So this is actually not an attack on his personal Sunday school style, but there was a sort of a sense of him in politics that sometimes he was lecturing people like you might envision a Sunday school teacher, right? That you kind of almost like wagging the finger, a little bit like you should know better, you should do the right thing. Ultimately that was a political liability.
And we'll certainly dive deeper into that leadership style when we talk about the specifics on his presidency and his time in office. But as you noted, he was a man of faith. He taught at Sunday school. He's a man from rural Georgia. He was famously a peanut farmer. It was kind of a surprise that his particular upbringing and background and where he grew up, not accustomed to a run at the White House when he was elected. So what was it about Carter that made him so appealing in 1976? Why did America choose the peanut farmer from Georgia?
People weren't doing it initially, but he came across positively. He was a little bit of a palate cleanser, if you want to think about it. For a country that had been
it'd been through a lot.
Yeah, well, it really had been, and even so Gerald Ford, who becomes president when Richard Nixon resigns, had been a popular politician, but he was tarred by the fact that he pardons Nixon, and that was not very popular at the time. By the way, that's aged fairly well. A lot of people feel as if that was something that enabled the country to move on and really to maybe make 1976, able to focus on the future. Right?
Sure.
That's what Ford had attempted to do, but it was definitely a liability that he had done that. And so Carter's election was sort of the pendulum swing, towards somebody who was overtly moral, who wore that on his sleeve. And he was different, and I think a lot of people voted for him thinking, like, we need something different.
I want to talk about his connectability with the American people while he was in office. As you noted, he was a bit of a palate cleanser after the Nixon-Ford administration. What role did Carter play in, I don't want to say reconnecting the people to the White House or re-entrusting the White House, but what did Carter do to almost reimagine how people think of a presidential administration coming out of Nixon and Ford?
So he goes to Iowa. Famously, in fact, in some ways, Iowa, he's made by Iowa. Iowa was this is a new thing, the caucuses then, to have it that prominently.
Which seems so strange because we think about Iowa all the time now. Going to Iowa is a necessity now.
Well, it is and remains that way for the Republicans, but famously not for the Democrats. So interestingly, it's Jimmy Carter's passing sort of comes at the closing of the book for his party, right? The Iowa will not play the prominent role that it has in the past in being that sort of first contest.
Good point.
But it was absolutely. Carter makes Iowa. Iowa makes Carter. They're it's a symbiotic sort of thing. He can't run for. See, he'd been governor in 1970 here in Georgia. At the time, Georgia governors only could run for one term, so they were not eligible for a second term in office. So in 74, he decides to throw his hat in the rink and just camps out in Iowa, which is something that people have done since then. But it was this new thing to invest this much time and energy, going to the state fair, going to all the things that you do in each of Iowa's 99 counties, and making a splash. And he does this and he connects, and I think he comes across as genuine. So even when he wasn't known nationally, people in Iowa had been seeing quite a bit of him. He came to introduce himself, as he would say, I'm Jimmy Carter, because people say, who is it? I'm Jimmy Carter, and I'm running for president, right? In his folksy way.
Let's get into his presidency now. He's elected president. Are there any moments from his presidency that stand out to you the most, more than others?
Yes, some of them were very positive.
Yes,
and then others were he was having to react to crises. So, oil shocks was a big one that sort of bedeviled his presidency for a while. And then not unrelated to this, the Iranian Revolution, and then the capture of 52 hostages in the embassy in Iran later that year in 1979 came to define the last year of the year plus of his presidency. His popularity spikes immediately after the hostages are taken, but then after it goes on for 444 days. So it lasts a very long time, and there's a failed rescue attempt. American populace sort of sees him as a weak leader. Whether that's true or not, you can make arguments. There are also some pretty significant international things that I think have been much better received by historians. Certainly, the way he handled Panama. Panama was complicated. For a lot of different reasons.
Panama's been complicated since Theodore Roosevelt.
Yeah. Well, yes, and fair enough, right? So there was a treaty, right? The United States had a treaty, to essentially to own the Panama Canal. So here's a case where taking some steps to give the Panama Canal back to Panama actually plays well with Latin America. By making the United States look like a responsible partner instead of a kind
imperialistic
of,
power.
Imperialistic power, right? But it didn't poll well, and in fact, Carter didn't even want during the campaign was very, very hesitant to give Panama back. And I don't think that was a political sort of stand of his. So Ford had been working towards liberalization of the Panama Canal, but initially Carter is very sort of lukewarm about it. Ford faced a Republican challenger, Ronald Reagan, we successful in 1980 against Jimmy Carter, but in 1976 he loses the Republican nomination, and he had been against doing anything with Panama. And so Carter was closer to Reagan initially. But this is something that I think would help to define Carter. He came into office and, he had some people who were there to sort of advise him about what had been happening. And pretty quickly he changes his mind. And I'd like to think, I have these conversations with my students. I'd like to think that, that you're open to that happening, right? Occasionally you learn some stuff and you find out things that tell you that you need to be going in a different direction. And I think that this is what happens to Carter in Panama.
So what was Carter's leadership style during all of this then? Obviously he's playing a role administratively, but how would he communicate these issues to the American people? How would he either calm nerves, or how would he instruct people to live their lives? How would he show his reaction to us?
The concept of responsibility was always very important to President Carter. Do you know Strength's Quest?
I do not know.
It's one of these, these personality things, right? So okay. There are these, these 30 strengths that, you can test, and, I have no idea. I certainly do not have firsthand knowledge of what Jimmy Carter's Strength's Quest score would be, but I'm betting that he scores high on the responsibility. No, seriously, he felt responsibility in certain areas, and when you had responsibility, that meant that you said you're going to do something, you did it, right? If you had something you're supposed to do, you're supposed to do it, and you expect it of yourself and you expect it of others, right? And part of this is his training. He believed that you could fix complex problems by studying them. He worked really hard. This was not a man that was on the golf course a lot, right?
Sure.
He worked 12-hour days and read a lot, studied a lot, but when he felt like he had a solution, then he would sometimes browbeat Congress in order to get it, and sometimes he would talk about. He would talk about what he thought that the American people needed to do to sacrifice, and particularly over the issue of energy, he did this. He famously says during the 70s, as there's instability over oil because of the situation in the Middle East, he calls for conservation. He wasn't alone in doing this, but he was doing it, and he comes to the American people and says, we need you to treat this like it's a big deal. In fact, what he says is that it's the moral equivalent of war. Okay, so the moral equivalent of war, which his detractors, Republicans and others, quickly call by the acronym MEOW, right? And this is a for many Americans, this became a projection of Carter, as timid, as weak, calling for sacrifice. There's a great tradition of that during times of war, and that's what Carter's calling on. He's calling on people to sacrifice for the greater good. Americans just generally don't like to do that for long periods of time, and even so, we, the history of doing that is, we get impatient, and I think that was an unfortunate phrasing, or at least the way it was able to be billed as meow, right? Because it got right at the way his political opponents wanted to portray him. Gasoline rationing is an example, I think, of one of these ways in which he could be sort of the scolding politician.
Was it a policy that was too little too late? Because at least he was president and calling for this in the 1970s. That's only one generation removed from rationing in World War II. Was it just that it was too recent to then, that there wasn't an appetite for it? Or why was it not as successful or not seen as so positively that maybe it could have been.
I think you're right to bring up World War II. So gasoline rationing takes place in World War II, and it's somewhat successful. The difference is that people understood during World War II what the costs were. They understood that this was something. They understood why they were being called to do it.
Okay.
Famously, in the 70s, lots of people thought that the oil crisis was manufactured by oil companies. So part of it is that they just didn't necessarily believe it. Gasoline rationing was successful largely because people bought into it. Could they avoid it if they wanted to? Yeah, they could do it. You could get away around rationing, but they didn't. They chose to do it because, and there was some social pressure to do it. The issue of gasoline rationing for Carter was actually Congress. It was seen to be the responsible thing. We need a plan because if there was a serious oil shock, there could just be bedlam at the gas pump, right? If there's no plan, it would be extremely disruptive. So the idea was that you have a plan in place, not because anybody wants it. Nobody wants it. The issue with gasoline rationing is there are winners and losers. So like if you live in a city versus you live, in a rural area, do you base it on the by numbers of driver's licenses, or do you base it on the number of car registrations? So you get very different responses, and at some level, Carter didn't care. I mean, it's not that he didn't care, but he understood that there were winners. He was willing to let Congress figure out a plan. The problem is that any decisions that Congress made were going to favor some groups over others, and so Carter kept making sort of tweaks to proposals, trying to get something passed, not because he cared passionately about a specific approach to any of those things, but they just needed to have a plan, and Congress was not able to do it. It was not able to make it happen, and when Congress fails in doing it, Carter gets out his wagging finger and blasts them. I mean, really, the headlines the next day are, President tells off Congress. I mean, it's really like and says you're being irresponsible. It's sort of getting kind of that scolding type of thing, and without really sort of understanding the political realities. And in fact, he chastises them for not thinking of nation before their locale. It's just very difficult to ask a congressman from New York to pass something that the perception is it's really the policy is made for people in Kentucky. So and the fact that those politicians were trying to advocate for their districts was just not something that Carter could really he didn't care. He said it's not about politics, and they looked at him like, do you want to be here? Like, do you want to get elected? The reality is political, and so this is what happens. I mean, he eventually gets a gasoline rationing plan, but he ends up shouldering all the political fallout for it. It does not help his relationship with Congress, and this is despite the fact that he had huge majorities. I mean, there were Democratic majorities, but he was because of sort of this stance was sort of burning a lot of political capital. It's the kind of thing that caused him some difficulty. So
he just didn't subscribe to a political capital theory.
Well, I think he understood it in the abstract. He just, in the end of the day, didn't really think it was important.
I'd like to talk about his post-presidency now. He's one of those guys who's almost unique in American history, where he's known almost more for his accomplishments after being president, because he's so accomplished. He wins a Nobel Peace Prize well after his presidency. He's working to remove or eradicate guinea worm. Can you talk a little bit about how this personality style became so productive, and what do you think drove him to continue making these impacts after having what's famously the most difficult job in the world?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jacob. I think, and there's a lot in that. He has, 40, more than 42 years post-presidency. By far the longest term ex-president that we've had. That's 7.5 presidential terms. So he had a long time. I do think it's important to see a lot of what he was doing as a continuation of things that he started in many cases in the White House, so things he cared about. So if you take a look at his work with elections and other things, an outgrowth of peace initiatives, which were definitely part of, for instance, the Camp David Accords and other sorts of things. He's able to be successful in a lot of these efforts because of the priorities that he had in the White House. So his by coming out forcefully against apartheid, that gives him credibility in Africa to do a lot of the different sorts of programs that he creates. So the mechanism for this is the Carter Center, so that his presidential library. So you can go, as I did, if you're doing research on Carter, you can go and you can look through his files, right? And then there's a museum downstairs, but it's also sort of a think tank. So it's this very, very active place that is working on the things that Carter valued. So he was I think seen as an honest broker. So famously, George Herbert Walker Bush administration comes out early when there's going to be elections again in Panama, and sort of says in advance that they don't think that these elections are going to be fair. And Carter sort of looks at Noriega and says, I think he can be fair. It's interesting. And in some ways, you might even think it's political, because Carter was wrong. Noriega, it was not right. But actually, what he did by saying that he thought that he could be fair was he was trusted by people in Latin America. And so when he then later calls out Noriega, the Carter Center sends a team down, and when he later calls out Noriega and said, nope, it was corrupt, people said, okay, well, it's corrupt. And whereas if the American response had always been that we told you so, right? It would have come off a little bit differently. You also mentioned he's involved in all these positive feel good types of things, and a lot of people have made the point that he's in some ways a much more successful ex-president than he was a president. He also upset some people, as post-president, got involved
inevitably,
in things, got involved in things, and it is a little tricky, right? Because we only have one president at a time, and there's some problems when there's a perception that you have multiple people speaking for the United States, and for the most part, Carter knew that, and he knew he wasn't president anymore, and so he would do that. But there were some times when he would say things that would sometimes get him in trouble, and that, or at least with some people.
Obviously, when it comes to being in the White House, a lot of the job is learning how to do it on the fly. If you could, in your research, if you could sum up the biggest lesson on how to be president we learned from President Carter, what do you think that lesson would be?
It's a tough one, Jacob. There's a lot of cautionary tales of what not to do. Serious.
I agree
that they're it is a political position. You don't get to just govern. And you have to build allies, and you have to. So I do think that a good relationship with Congress is something that is just essential. You got to have a good team that knows how to do that. So I think that's maybe one of the things. But more on the positive side, to center. Carter is responsible for getting the United States behind human rights as being a defining part of what foreign policy should be. I think that's a good message to leave by. I don't know. Your question was more about strategy, how to be president, as opposed to some of the other things I might emphasize. I might also sort of lean back into one of the things he did when he was campaigning, and again, this sort of in the age of Watergate. He says, "I will never lie to you." This is part of his shtick. He says, "I'm not going to lie to you." And
is your lesson that maybe lying is okay?
No, I've said that some things you shouldn't do, but the cover, lying, the cover up, that's what gets people into trouble, he didn't have those kinds of problems. The problems he had were kind of in the public, for the most part.
Well, Dr. Caplinger, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Yeah, thanks, Jacob. It was fun.